Ready to journey back? Let's explore the evolution of gas prices and uncover what it cost in the 60s. Let's begin.
The story so far.
Gas prices have an almost mystical quality in American life. They're more than just digits on a sign by the highway. They can spark debates at the dinner table, shape conversations about politics, and even dictate family vacation plans. When those numbers nudge upward, we brace ourselves for wallet pains and wonder what's happening in the world to create the spike. Conversely, when they fall, we celebrate with a triumphant fill-up, feeling like we've discovered a hidden pot of gold. But the truth is, looking at the pump is like staring into an economic crystal ball. It reflects global supply chains, corporate decision-making, environmental concerns, government policies, and the day-to-day realities of working families. In the 1960s, gas prices were shockingly low by today's standards. Today, it's routine to pay upwards of $3 or $4 per gallon, depending on your location. But half a century ago, drivers could fill up for an amount that might fall out of your pocket while you're scrounging for laundry quarters. Despite seeming like a trivial detail, these low fuel costs shaped entire lifestyles. Picture cruising down Main Street in a bulky Chevy Impala without flinching at every sip of gasoline it took. Back then, cheap fuel meant freedom of mobility. You could hop in your car and just drive, no second thoughts. Taking a spontaneous family trip on a Sunday afternoon was almost expected, especially with the expansion of highways, the increasing popularity of suburban life, and a culture that reveled in the open road. Gas prices matter because they encapsulate so many facets of life. How we shop, how we commute, how we socialize, and how we think about our budgets. The allure of the 60s is that it was a decade of large-scale economic expansion, a time of big cars, big dreams, and a sense of boundless possibility. And cheap gas was right at the center of it all. It was more than just a number at the pump. It was a reason Americans felt free to roam, to get behind the wheel, and to assume tomorrow would be even brighter and more prosperous. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine and road trips. There were complexities, conflicts, and controversies swirling beneath that veneer of affordable fuel, which we'll dig into. For now, let's set the scene. Low prices, enthusiastic motorists, and a nation in love with the idea of rolling out of their driveway with a full tank and a wide-open future. Back to the future. If you've ever daydreamed about stepping into a time machine and cruising straight into the 1960s, you're not alone. There's something irresistibly charming about that era, from the music on the AM radio to the glimmering tail fins on the cars. And speaking of cars, let's talk about what it cost to keep those beauties fueled. In 1965, the average price of gasoline hovered around 31 cents per gallon. Sure, wages were lower and the economy was different, but when you consider that a crisp dollar bill and some loose change could buy you multiple gallons, it's no wonder the 60s had a legendary car culture. People took pride in their roadsters and cruisers, treating them almost like members of the family. The 60s were a high watermark for American optimism. The post, World War II boom was still rippling through society, suburbs were growing, and homeownership was within reach for many young families. Plus, an increasing number of highways made travel by car quicker and more appealing. Fueling up that station wagon or convertible wasn't a big deal, which meant spontaneous getaways were both feasible and fashionable. The idea of heading out on Route 66 to discover a piece of America was practically baked into the nation's collective imagination. And when you arrived at a gas station, you'd likely be greeted by a friendly attendant who'd not only pump the gas for you, but also check your oil, wipe your windshield, and maybe even offer a road map if you were headed somewhere new. Talk about service. Yet there's a slightly under-discussed side to this sunny picture. The prices seemed low, but inflation adjustments tell a slightly more complicated tale. 30 cents in 1960 translates to around $2 to $3 today, depending on how you measure it. While still cheaper than some modern spikes, it wasn't quite as dirt cheap as it sounds in purely nominal terms. But let's not ruin the nostalgic aura too much. By and large, people in the 60s did enjoy relatively affordable gas, especially considering the wide range of socioeconomic factors at play. It was the era of big engines, big dreams, and the open road beckoning people to explore. The accessibility of cheap fuel was a hallmark of the time, one that future generations would look back on with a mix of fondness, envy, and curiosity. After all, how could something so essential to modern life be so cheap compared to now? In a few more sections, we'll see how that changed and why controversies started popping up like daisies on a summer lawn. The price is wrong. So, how did we go from roughly 30 cents a gallon in the 60s to the price roller coaster we see today? If we chart the course from 1960 to our current decade, we find a story shaped by geopolitics, technology, environmental policy, and plain old supply and demand economics. In the 1960s, the United States was a leading oil producer, and it comfortably supplemented domestic production with imports. Domestic refineries were humming and oil companies reaped healthy profits, but consumers rarely felt gouged. Things began to shift as the decade drew to a close and rolled into the 70s. One major event was the formation of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, a collective of oil-producing nations that found strength in unity. Suddenly, these nations could exert more control over oil supply, which directly impacted global prices. The 1973 oil embargo, triggered by geopolitical conflicts, sent shockwaves through the global economy. Gas lines, odd-even rationing days, and emergency measures became part of the American lexicon. Prices jumped. Even after the embargo lifted, the ramifications persisted, with each subsequent global conflict or economic downturn leaving its mark on the price at the pump. By the time you reached the 21st century, gas prices had become a barometer of political debate. People argue about offshore drilling, pipeline projects, and alternative energy sources, all while comparing how much they paid for a fill-up last week versus this week. Environmental awareness also grew. Leaded gasoline, common in the 60s, was eventually phased out due to health risks. Cleaner-burning fuel formulations added to production costs. So, while folks in the 60s reminisced about paying pocket change for a gallon, modern environmental regulations, stricter quality controls, and advanced refining processes have altered the equation. All these factors swirl together like a thick stew to influence what you pay every time you squeeze the pump trigger. The price swings might seem random if you look at them day to day, but they make a lot more sense in the context of decades of global politics, changing consumer demands, and evolving technologies. Back in the 60s, it was simpler, or at least it seemed that way. Cheap, widely available fuel allowed Americans to roam the roads freely, shaping a culture of drive-ins, Sunday drives, and cross-country family adventures. It's only when you zoom out that you see how unique that period really was. The cracks in that cheap gas era were starting to form even before 1970 ended. Looking back, it's intriguing to see how the seeds of change were already there, just waiting for the right geopolitical spark to flip the switch and create the price realities we deal with today. How did it all start? The dream car of the 60s was often a big, brash, chrome-laden piece of art. You had hulking sedans, muscle cars, and station wagons that rivaled small boats in size. Think of the Chevrolet Impala, Ford Galaxy, or the Oldsmobile 98. These were land yachts that devoured fuel. Still, drivers didn't worry much because gas was affordable, making miles per gallon a lesser concern. Horsepower, styling, and that signature rumble of a V8 engine took priority. It was the golden age of American automotive design, with each manufacturer racing to outdo the other in cubic inches under the hood. The benefits of that era? You got cars that were roomy, comfortable, and brimming with personality. Road trips were less cramped, especially if you were a kid perched in the back seat, free to stretch out without a seatbelt. Safety standards were different back then, to say the least. Open highways and scenic routes beckoned, and families actually used them, piling into their cars to visit relatives or national parks. The typical middle-aged American today might recall childhood memories of lying across a plush back seat, gazing at passing clouds through the side windows, the radio humming tunes from the Beach Boys or the Beatles. In many ways, these memories are treasured because they were made possible by cheap, abundant gas that made it easy to keep rolling down the highway. However, there were drawbacks. One is environmental. These gas-guzzling beauties spewed more pollutants. Another is that the emphasis on engine size and raw power overshadowed advancements in efficiency. Imagine if auto manufacturers had been pushed to innovate eco-friendly technology earlier. Our modern world might look different. Fuel economy wasn't top of mind, and concerns about smog and carbon emissions were mostly overshadowed by the desire for a smooth, powerful ride. And let's not forget leaded gasoline, which we'll talk about in more depth soon. This fuel, while great for engine performance, introduced a toxic metal into the air. Looking at the 60s car culture now, it seems both nostalgic and a bit shocking. Yes, they had iconic designs and a sense of unbridled freedom, but the term gas guzzler was well earned. It's a fascinating dichotomy for middle-aged Americans who lived through or have strong family ties to that period. They remember the convenience and the joy of the open road, but they can also see the bigger picture in hindsight. The 60s gave us big steel machines rolling down the highway, courtesy of cheap gas. And that unstoppable wave of bigger is better mentality wouldn't truly be challenged until fuel crises and rising prices forced everyone to question whether all that horsepower was worth the cost. Environmental foresight. If you've ever watched old footage of classic cars at the pump, you might notice something on the signage that you rarely see today. Regular gasoline was loaded with tetrethyl lead. By the 60s, leaded gas was standard, intended to boost octane levels and reduce engine knocking. Drivers rarely questioned it. After all, it gave engines more pep and was widely touted by manufacturers. But behind the scenes, medical professionals and environmental scientists were starting to worry. Lead is a potent neurotoxin, particularly harmful to children. Over time, concerns grew that these exhaust fumes could contaminate the air, soil, and water supplies, leading to long-term health implications. Controversy brewed as oil companies resisted the push to remove lead, citing performance issues and cost. Meanwhile, public health advocates argued for phasing it out in favor of unleaded gas. Government agencies eventually intervened, leading to a gradual ban on leaded gasoline starting in the 1970s. But in the 1960s, that shift was still on the horizon. For folks who fondly recall paying pennies per gallon, it can be jarring to realize that each of those gallons contained a heavy metal that posed a serious health risk. The widespread use of leaded gasoline is part of the complicated legacy of cheap gas in the 60s. It delivered power and affordability at the expense of cleaner air. This leads us to the broader issue of environmental foresight, or rather the lack of it. While the 60s were a time of technological optimism, with the space race in full swing, environmental awareness was still relatively niche. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had only just been published in 1962, sparking debates about pesticides and ecological harm, but the broader national conversation around pollution and emissions was still muted. Large swaths of Americans weren't connecting the dots between their tailpipes and air quality. Factories belched out smoke, cars spewed out lead, and the average family simply filled up the tank without a second thought. Jokes aside, it's almost mind-blowing to think how normal this all was. People might remember the sweetish smell of exhaust at a busy intersection, not realizing that they were inhaling tiny particles of a toxic metal. Gas was cheap, and the environment was rarely a topic of dinner-table discussion. The controversies we see today, over climate change, air pollution, and the cost of gasoline, trace their roots back to these decades of carefree fuel usage. For better or worse, the 60s stand as a reminder that convenience and performance can sometimes overshadow long-term health and environmental considerations. And that's one reason the topic remains so intriguing. It's a reflection of how much society has changed its priorities over time, and how those shifts in priorities eventually filter down to the price and composition of the fuel we use. Wave of changes. When you talk about gas prices in the 60s, the next logical step is to look at what happened immediately after. The 1970s brought a wave of changes. Chief among them was the oil embargo of 1973, courtesy of OPEC countries, which caused a shortage and sent prices spiking. Americans, accustomed to cruising without care, found themselves in long lines, sometimes waiting hours to get a limited ration of fuel. The psychological shock was enormous. The days of sub-40-cent gallons disappeared faster than a dropped donut at a county fair. By 1974, the national average gas price had nearly doubled. Adjusted for inflation, it was still relatively modest compared to some modern surges, but the culture shock was undeniable. Another jolt came in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution. Supply disruptions and uncertainty once again caused prices to skyrocket. If the 1960s had lulled Americans into a sense of security about fuel, the 1970s served as a bucket of cold water. Suddenly, compact, fuel-efficient cars began to gain appeal. Imports like Honda and Toyota, once niche, started grabbing larger slices of the market because they sipped fuel rather than chugging it. Meanwhile, domestic manufacturers scrambled to produce smaller, more efficient models. All those glorious V8-powered sedans looked less appealing when the driver had to worry about the price per gallon creeping closer to $1, which was a mental barrier at the time. This shift also brought about new regulations. The federal government introduced corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards, to push manufacturers toward efficiency. Environmental consciousness, spurred by the Clean Air Act of 1970 and subsequent amendments, led to catalytic converters and unleaded fuel requirements. What's really interesting is how this chain of events made Americans look back on the 60s with an almost wistful nostalgia. The 60s started feeling like a lost era of innocence. Gas was cheap, the roads were open, and the largest problem you might face was whether you wanted to supersize your engine. That said, these price jumps also sparked innovation and a new wave of thinking about energy independence. While some controversies remain, like debates over drilling in protected areas or the push for renewable energy sources, it's undeniable that the challenges of the 1970s forced the nation to confront realities that the 60s had blissfully ignored. The story of gas in America can't be separated from these global and national events. It's why the 60s stand out as a unique bubble, sealed off by world events that would soon burst it wide open. People remember those days not just because of the price, but because of the entire worldview that cheap fuel represented. It was a time when the average family could dream big and drive far, unaware that the next decade would bring a far more complicated picture at the pump. Gas war. One of the funniest aspects of 60s gas culture was the so-called gas war. Station owners along the same stretch of road would engage in a race to the bottom, slashing prices by a cent or two in an effort to draw customers away from competing stations. Imagine driving into town and seeing one station with a sign reading 29 cents, only to spot another across the street boasting 28 cents. These skirmishes might seem petty, but they were serious business. Station owners would lose a small amount on each gallon sold, betting on volume and customer loyalty to make up the difference. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it made for some interesting stories. Another lesser-known fact: promotional giveaways were rampant. Some stations would lure you in with collectible glasses or dinnerware. Yes, dinnerware. Can you picture heading home to your spouse, beaming with pride that you got a set of matching coffee mugs simply by filling up the tank? Kids, on the other hand, were enthralled by toy cars, baseball cards, or funny-looking rubber mascots. Each brand had its own marketing gimmicks, which they'd proudly advertise on billboards or local TV commercials. It added an almost carnival-like atmosphere to something as mundane as buying gas. And let's not forget about the physical road maps. Back in the 60s, GPS was pure science fiction, so printed maps were invaluable. Companies like Texaco, Esso, and Gulf churned out free maps that were both functional and beautifully illustrated. Opening them up was like gazing into a tapestry of highways, byways, and scenic routes, each beckoning you to explore. Some folks even collected these maps for their artwork, or to preserve memories of special trips. Quirky marketing strategies aside, a truly surprising detail is how regional differences impacted prices. If you lived near major refineries on the Gulf Coast, you might pay significantly less than someone inland. State taxes also varied widely. In some areas, competition was so fierce that prices dropped below 20 cents in promotional bursts. These ephemeral bargains led to lines of cars around the block, as people eagerly jockeyed for a pump to capitalize on the sale before it ended. It was a spectacle, to be sure. Looking back on these lesser-known facts, you can see that the 60s were about more than just cheap fuel. They were about the community that formed around service stations, the thrill of deals, and the unspoken joy of a little friendly competition. It's almost whimsical to imagine gas station attendants desperately trying to outdo one another over a penny. Yet that was the reality, and it's part of why stories from that era remain so entertaining. Sure, some of these promotions were borderline gimmicky, but they gave everyday folks a reason to smile when they pulled in to fill up. And in a way, that sense of playfulness is something many people miss today, when filling up often feels more like a chore than an event. Cultural touchstone. With all this talk of the 1960s, you might wonder, was it all good or were there obvious downsides? Let's weigh some of the benefits first. For one, cheap gas gave people a level of freedom and spontaneity that's harder to replicate now. Weekend road trips, visits to out-of-state relatives, or even just joy rides with friends were more accessible. Since the cost wasn't prohibitive, families could focus on other aspects of their budget, such as a nicer home, a new TV, or even sending kids to college. The road trip culture also strengthened family bonds, as countless folks have fond memories of cross-country adventures that might not have happened if gas had been pricey. Another benefit lay in the social fabric that formed around automobiles. The car wasn't just transportation, it was a statement of style and status. Because fuel was affordable, having a flashier, more powerful ride didn't feel like a financial black hole. Jobs in the oil industry were plentiful and well-paying, supporting entire communities. Meanwhile, gas stations served as community hubs where neighbors might catch up on local gossip or plan upcoming events. However, there were drawbacks, big ones. Cheap gas encouraged wastefulness. Cars were designed with power in mind, not efficiency. This approach contributed to higher emissions, more pollution, and a reluctance to adapt to more sustainable fuels. The environment eventually paid the price, with cities suffering from smog and children unwittingly inhaling lead-laced exhaust. Financially, the illusion of never-ending cheap oil set up future generations for a rude awakening when geopolitical situations changed in the 70s. The shockwaves from the oil embargo and subsequent price spikes might have been less severe if the nation had been more prepared. Then there's the health aspect. We briefly mentioned leaded fuel, which is now universally recognized as detrimental to public health. In the 60s, few questioned its usage, but the toll on kids growing up in those years might never be fully quantified. There were also worker safety concerns in refineries, and environmental degradation in oil-producing regions often went overlooked. The 60s, while arguably a magical time for motoring, were simultaneously laying the groundwork for some of the biggest energy and environmental crises of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Why is all this so interesting? Because it tells a story about how society balances progress with responsibility. The 60s were an incredible era of innovation and expansion, buoyed by an assumption that resources, like cheap oil, were essentially infinite. It's both an inspiring and cautionary tale. Middle-aged Americans who lived through some of these transitions or heard stories from their parents have a unique perspective. They can recall the carefree days of cheap fill-ups, even as they now shell out substantially more per gallon and consider issues like carbon footprints, electric vehicles, and climate change. That interplay between nostalgia and modern awareness keeps the 60s fuel phenomenon a hot topic for discussion, even decades later. That being said, it's a testament to how something so mundane, gas prices, can become a cultural touchstone that resonates far beyond the pump. Outro. It's incredible to think how a simple number on a gas station sign can encapsulate an entire era's dreams, habits, and challenges. The 60s were a time of unbridled optimism, and cheap gas was both a symbol and a driver of that buoyant spirit. Families roamed far and wide in large, comfortable automobiles, forging memories that would last a lifetime. However, beneath the surface lay controversies. Leaded fuel, environmental oversight, and an over-reliance on what seemed like an endless resource. When prices eventually soared in the 70s, Americans had to adapt, and they never quite looked at the pump the same way again. Yet the fascination endures, especially for those middle-aged Americans who can recall or imagine the thrill of paying mere coins per gallon. It's a tangible reminder of how swiftly times can change, and how even our most cherished conveniences come with trade-offs. Hope you found this video helpful in rekindling the spirit of that era and shedding light on why the 60s still captivate our collective imagination. Jokes aside, understanding the past helps us navigate the present with more clarity. If you enjoyed traveling down memory lane, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can join me for more nostalgic journeys and informative deep dives on all things retro, automotive, and beyond. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.